On a stormy night in Maplewood, rain hammered against shattered rooftops and the wind howled through the empty streets. At the stroke of midnight, a sudden knock rose above the roar of the storm. When Clara opened the door, a barefoot boy stood trembling, rain streaming down his pale face. His voice, steady yet broken with fear, pleaded through the thunder. "I need $5,000, or my mom will die." This is not just about money. It is about the courage to act, the sacrifice of one soul for another, and the quiet power of kindness that can break through prejudice. As you listen, imagine yourself in Clara's place. What would you have done? Would you open that door? Would you take the risk? Share your thoughts in the comments, and may your day be filled with light and compassion. The night over Maplewood had never seemed so heavy, and as the echoes of the last story faded, the new one began under a sky that roared like a wounded animal. The small town, already poor and shrinking, was wrapped in sheets of rain and darkness, its crooked streets abandoned except for the wind. Lightning showed broken rooftops and sagging porches, thunder rattled loose shutters, and the few lamps that once tried to hold back the dark had already flickered out. It was past midnight, and only one building on the corner of Willow Street glowed faintly, a stubborn square of yellow light pressed against the storm. Inside that light sat Clara Johnson, 60 years old, her figure wrapped in a worn brown coat and a gray scarf tied firmly at her neck. She was a black woman, marked by years of survival, her skin deep brown and her eyes carrying the stillness of someone who had been tested too often. Her husband long gone, her name passed from mouth to mouth with quiet judgment. She endured in the one place that remained hers, a narrow general store with peeling paint and a sign faded to near invisibility. She could not sleep, so she sat near the stove, cane resting against the chair, watching the small fire and remembering the voices that once filled her life. Clara had been many things in Maplewood: an outsider, the widow of a man the town never forgave her for marrying, and the woman foolish enough to stay when others fled. People whispered as she walked to church. Children were told not to linger in her store, and yet she remained, not because she loved the town, but because leaving would have meant giving up the last roots that tied her to her parents. Tonight she let her eyes drift across the tidy aisles, the cans arranged in neat rows, the nails stacked carefully, as though order could keep chaos at bay. She did not expect a knock on her door, only the groan of wood and the whistle of wind. Beyond the glow of her store, the storm belonged to a boy named Ethan Ward. 9 years old, white, skinny to the bone, he ran barefoot down a street that seemed endless, his shirt plastered to his chest and his thin shorts clinging like wet paper. His hair, light brown and tangled, whipped into his eyes as he gasped for air, his small body shaking not only from cold, but from fear sharpened by urgency. He had left his mother under a sagging tarp at the edge of town, her breathing ragged, her skin pale, and he carried in his mind a single number he did not truly understand. $5,000, the price someone had named for a chance at her life. Ethan's steps splashed through puddles, his teeth chattered, and yet his determination burned with a strange brightness, the kind children sometimes carry when they are forced to grow up too quickly. The storm mocked him with every gust, the rain cut at his bare legs, but he kept going because stopping was not an option. He did not know where help could be found, but he knew he had to keep searching. Then, through the sheets of water, headlights swept across the street, and a police cruiser slowed to a stop. Behind the wheel sat Sheriff Tom Walker, 55 years old, a thick-shouldered white man with a square jaw and the weary eyes of someone who had lived too long with the weight of other people's mistakes. His uniform was buttoned to the collar, his hat brim slick with water, and he carried himself like a man who clung to duty even when it no longer clung to him. Years of enforcing law in a crumbling town had left his voice gravelly, his patience thin, but his sense of authority intact. He rolled the window down and leaned toward the storm. "Where are you headed, son?" he asked, his tone half concern, half warning. Ethan stopped in the glare of the headlights, chest heaving, and shouted through the rain with a voice cracked but clear. "I need $5,000, sir. If I don't get it now, my mom will die." The words tumbled out with the rawness of truth, and for a moment, even the storm seemed to pause. Sheriff Walker's eyes narrowed, taking in the boy's bare feet, his trembling fists, his soaked clothes clinging to sharp bones. He saw desperation, but he also saw something that did not fit his tired belief in how the world worked. Tom's instinct reached for caution. He had seen cons, pranks, and desperate acts born of hunger. The request sounded impossible, absurd even. $5,000 from a child? He shook his head, convincing himself the boy must have run away, must be confused, must be telling a story no one could afford to believe. "Don't play games with me," he barked, his voice rough. "Storms like this get folks killed. Go home before you freeze out here." Ethan stepped closer, his face shining with rain and desperation. "Please, sir, I'm not lying." "Please," his voice trembled but did not break, and his eyes, wide and pleading, begged for someone to see him, to hear him. Sheriff Walker gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles pale, and for a heartbeat, something inside him hesitated. But the storm pushed, the night pressed, and his fatigue drowned the doubt. He closed the window, shifted the gear, and the cruiser rolled away, red taillights smearing into the dark rain. The boy stood alone, chest rising and falling in uneven gasps, his hope punctured but not extinguished. The rain lashed harder, the wind shoved at his small body, and for a moment he wanted to cry out, to collapse into the water and let the storm decide. But instead he clenched his fists tighter, swallowed the fear, and forced his legs to move again. He turned his back on the empty street, the sound of the cruiser already fading, and kept running because running was the only choice left. Maplewood gave him nothing as he stumbled past boarded windows and sagging roofs, only the lonely flicker of a neon sign half burned out and the groan of power lines overhead. Each house seemed sealed against him, doors locked, curtains drawn, as if the storm had carried away the last fragments of compassion. Yet Ethan pressed forward, barefoot and shivering, because somewhere in the dark he believed there had to be light, and if he stopped searching, his mother's last breath would vanish into the storm. And far ahead, down Willow Street, that faint yellow glow still burned in Clara Johnson's store. She did not yet know that her life was about to be interrupted, that the storm would deliver to her door not a customer, but a desperate child whose words would pierce through years of silence. For now, she only sipped the cold tea she refused to throw away, her cane resting at her side, her body weary, but her lamp still lit, as though she had been waiting all along. The storm pressed down on Maplewood with a fury that seemed endless, each gust of wind rattling the broken gutters and sweeping loose trash into dark corners. Water coursed down the streets in fast rivulets, pooling into deep puddles that reflected nothing but the jagged light of distant thunder. Ethan Ward, only 9 years old, staggered through this ruined night, his small body bent with exhaustion, his bare feet raw from stone and glass, his thin white shirt soaked until it clung like skin. His chest heaved painfully, each breath a struggle, his vision blurred by rain. And though he wanted to stop, to sink to the pavement and let the storm take him, something deep inside pushed him forward. He had promised his mother he would find a way, and promises, even from children, carry a weight the world should not underestimate. He stumbled around a corner where the wind shifted suddenly, lifting his wet hair from his forehead, and for a moment he thought his mind had betrayed him. Through the sheets of rain glowed a single square of yellow light, faint yet stubborn, shining through warped glass as if daring the storm to extinguish it. His legs nearly buckled with relief, his heart hammering with a desperate rhythm, and he blinked hard, afraid it might vanish if he looked too long. But the glow held steady, the only light in a town that had long since turned its face from him, and with a choked sob he whispered, "Don't go out. Please, don't go out." Gathering what little strength he had left, he staggered toward it, drawn like a moth clinging to its last chance. The building was small, its paint peeling in long strips, its roof sagging from years of neglect, and the sign above the door had faded until only faint outlines of letters remained. To anyone else it might have looked abandoned, but to Ethan it was a sanctuary. He pulled himself up the shallow steps, gripping the railing with trembling fingers, his knees quivering as though they might fold beneath him. With a weak fist he knocked, the sound muffled by the storm. No answer came, so he tried again, harder, desperate, his knuckles striking the wood with a hollow echo. Leaning against the doorframe, water streaming from his hair and clothes, he waited in silence, his entire body a plea. Inside, Clara Johnson had been dozing lightly in her chair near the stove, a chipped mug of cold tea balanced between her hands, the cane she leaned on resting at her side. 60 years old, a black woman marked by the long labor of life and the cruelties of her neighbors' whispers, she kept her light on. Not for customers, but because darkness had become a companion she didn't trust. The knock startled her into alertness, a sound so out of place at such an hour that she thought for a moment the storm had played a trick. But then it came again, sharper, carrying a weight she could not ignore. Her heart thudded heavily as suspicion clawed at her. She had been mocked before, doors kicked, cruel children laughing as they ran. Yet this sound carried something different. She rose slowly, steadying herself with her cane, and moved toward the door with careful steps. Pausing behind the warped glass, Clara squinted through the storm, but all she could see was the blur of rain. Another knock came, urgent and unmistakable, and with a slow breath she released the latch. The door creaked open just enough for the storm to shove its cold fingers inside, and there, framed in the pale light, stood a child who looked as though the night had already broken him. He was small, pale as candle wax, with light brown hair plastered to his forehead, his bare feet raw and red on the wooden porch. His gray eyes, wide and wild, locked onto hers with a desperation that froze her in place. For an instant her instinct screamed to close the door, to retreat into the fragile solitude she had carved from years of survival, but she could not look away. "What are you doing out here, child?" she asked, her voice low, stern out of habit but softer than she intended. The boy's chest rose and fell in ragged breaths, his lips trembling as he tried to form words. Finally, they burst out of him, cracked but steady. "Please, my mom is going to die. I need $5,000 right now, or she won't make it." The words were too large for him, too heavy for a child to carry, but they filled the room like thunder. Clara blinked, stunned by the plea, her mind tripping over the impossible number, her body stiff as memory pressed against her. The storm outside roared as though echoing the boy's urgency, and inside Clara's thoughts collided. Logic rose first, sharp and relentless. She owed him nothing, she had little enough herself, and the money she had set aside was meant for her own survival. $5,000 was more than charity. It was her future, her roof against the winter, her food for the lean months. Yet when she looked into the boy's eyes, she saw not a stranger, but a reflection of herself. Years ago, begging for help, turned away, left to carry grief alone. The ache of that abandonment tore through her, and in its shadow compassion bloomed. Ethan swayed, his body trembling so hard she thought he might collapse, and Clara reached out instinctively, her rough hand steadying his shoulder. She guided him inside, shutting the door against the storm, the warmth of the stove wrapping them in a fragile cocoon. She fetched an old wool coat, left behind by a traveler long ago, oversized and fraying but thick enough to fight the cold. Draping it around the boy's small frame, she tugged the collar close under his chin. He clutched it with trembling hands, whispering, "Thank you," through chattering teeth, but his eyes never left hers, still pleading, still begging for what seemed impossible. Clara turned to the counter, her cane tapping softly, and reached beneath it to a hidden drawer. From it, she lifted a dented metal tin, its weight familiar and dreaded, holding the careful savings of her lonely years. Her fingers shook as she opened it, bills stacked neatly inside, each one counted and recounted in the silence of nights like this. They were meant for repairs, for food, for survival. But in the presence of the boy's desperation, they looked like something else entirely. A choice. She stared at them, then at him. His thin body swallowed in the coat, his gray eyes shining with fragile hope, and knew there was no turning away. With a slow breath, she gathered the bills into her hands, stepped back to the boy, and pressed them firmly into his trembling grasp. Her voice, when it came, was steady, carrying a quiet authority. "I'm not worried about the money. I'm worried about you. Take it, child. Don't let your mama slip away." Ethan stared at the bundle, disbelief flickering across his pale face, then clutched it to his chest as though it were life itself. Tears welled in his eyes, spilling down cheeks already wet with storm, but behind them shone something brighter, the fragile rebirth of hope. Clara straightened slowly, her knees aching but her spirit firm, and though neither spoke again, the silence that filled the room was heavy with promise. Outside, the storm still battered Maplewood, tearing at rooftops and shaking windows. But inside Clara's small store, a vow had been sealed. A forgotten woman had chosen once more to give when no one else would, and a desperate boy had found light in the darkest night. The lamp burned on, defiant against the storm, its glow wrapping them both in a fragile circle that the world could not extinguish. The storm had not eased, its rage pounding Maplewood into submission. But inside Clara's store, a choice had already been made. She had placed her savings in Ethan's hands, had wrapped him in a coat too big for his shoulders, and now there was only one path left. The boy's eyes, wide and brimming with urgency, pulled her forward, as though the night itself had given her a command. Clara gripped her cane in one hand, steadied Ethan with the other, and together they stepped back into the torrent, leaving the fragile warmth of the store for the cold teeth of the storm. The streets swallowed them immediately, rain slicing across their faces, puddles rising high enough to splash their knees. Ethan moved quickly despite his exhaustion, his small frame pulled ahead by desperation alone, and Clara, though slowed by age and aching joints, pressed on with fierce determination. She leaned less on her cane now, more on a stubborn will that refused to let a child lead her into darkness alone. The town was silent except for the storm, windows shuttered, doors locked, no soul daring to witness what unfolded, and only the dim glow of Clara's lamp behind them gave proof that anyone still believed in light. They reached the edge of Maplewood, where streets gave way to broken lots and the husks of half-collapsed sheds. Ethan turned sharply, guiding her through a narrow passage littered with rusted cans and scraps of tarp, until finally a makeshift shelter came into view. It was nothing more than wood scraps leaned against two dead trees, a sagging blue tarp stretched over the top, flapping violently in the wind. Water streamed down its sides, and the ground beneath had become mud. Inside lay Eliza Ward, no more than 30, her pale skin tinted gray, her breath shallow, her thin arms twitching against her chest as though fighting for each second she could hold. Clara crouched as best she could, her cane sinking into the mud, and pressed 2 fingers to Eliza's wrist. The faint flutter of a pulse met her touch, but it was weak, fragile, threatening to vanish. Ethan knelt beside his mother, clutching her hand with both of his face pressed against her damp skin, whispering words she was too far gone to hear. Clara's eyes, sharp and commanding even in her age, scanned the dark lot for anything that might help, but there was nothing here but rot, mildew, and despair. She pulled the boy close enough to steady his shaking, and then, with a voice that cut through the rain, she said, "We call for help." Now, her hand found the payphone mounted crooked on a nearby wall of a shuttered service station. She jammed the coins she kept in her pocket into the slot, her voice urgent as she relayed the location, the state of the woman, the immediacy of the crisis. The operator's clipped reply promised dispatch, but Clara did not wait for comfort. She returned to the shelter, her presence anchoring Ethan while they listened for sirens that would cut through the storm. Minutes stretched long, broken only by Eliza's faint moans and the boy's whispered pleas, until at last the flashing red lights emerged from the veil of rain. The ambulance crew, a man and woman clad in reflective jackets, mid-30s, purposeful and calm, rushed forward, their boots sinking deep in the mud as they carried equipment. They worked with swift precision, lifting Eliza onto a stretcher, fitting an oxygen mask to her face, wrapping her in blankets to fight the cold. Ethan tried to climb onto the stretcher beside her, but the female paramedic shook her head gently, her voice kind but firm. "Stay close, we'll get her in." "She needs room to breathe." Clara's hand found Ethan's shoulder again, grounding him as the doors of the ambulance closed and the engine roared to life. Clara guided Ethan into the cab of the emergency vehicle, settling him onto the narrow bench, while she herself stood braced against the wall as the vehicle tore down the flooded road. The sirens screamed, splitting the storm in two, and Maplewood blurred past in a smear of shadows and water. Ethan clung to the coat she had given him, his small fists tight, his eyes never leaving the space where his mother lay behind the closed partition. Clara kept her gaze steady, her hand occasionally brushing his, each touch an unspoken vow that he would not endure this night alone. At the hospital, fluorescent light replaced stormlight, sharp and sterile, bouncing off white walls that smelled of bleach. Nurses swarmed the stretcher as it was wheeled through double doors marked "restricted," their voices professional and urgent. Ethan surged forward to follow, but a nurse knelt quickly to block him, voice firm yet soft. You need to wait here, sweetheart. Let us work. His small frame trembled with frustration, his fists clenched, but Clara bent down beside him, her cane set aside, her voice low. She's not alone. They're helping her. You did what you had to do. Sheriff Tom Walker appeared then, his heavy boots echoing on the tile, his broad frame filling the hallway. He looked surprised to see Clara there, her hand resting gently on the boy's back, her coat dripping water onto the floor. His eyes narrowed, suspicion hardening his jaw as he muttered, "This yours?" The words held more bite than he intended, but the image before him gave him pause. A black widow from Maplewood's margins, standing steadfast beside a white child, shielding him with nothing but her presence. Clara met his gaze evenly, saying nothing, but her silence carried the weight of defiance. Tom looked away, unsettled, though doubt gnawed at his certainty. The hours stretched long in the waiting room. Clara did not leave Ethan's side, sitting upright with the boy tucked against her, his head resting against the coat still heavy with rain. Nurses came and went, monitors beeped behind closed doors, but Clara remained steady, her presence a constant anchor. Sheriff Walker lingered at a distance, arms crossed, his face shadowed by something he would not name, part suspicion, part shame, part recognition of a devotion that asked no questions of race or blood. Each time his eyes drifted toward Clara, he felt the certainty of his judgments weaken. At dawn, the double doors opened and a doctor, young and weary-eyed, stepped out. He pulled off his gloves, his expression gentling as he spotted Ethan. "She's stable," he said, his words carrying the weight of relief. Ethan leapt from his chair, tears spilling fresh, and rushed past the threshold with Clara close behind, though she stopped short at the doorway. Inside the room, Eliza lay pale but breathing, the mask still at her face, her chest rising steadily. Her hand twitched, then lifted, weak but deliberate, and her lips parted. "Ethan," she whispered, voice hoarse but alive. The boy rushed forward, seizing her hand, pressing it to his cheek as tears poured freely. "Mama, I'm here," he choked, his small body shaking with joy and relief. Eliza blinked slowly, her gray eyes finally finding him, her fingers curling weakly around his. Clara stood in the shadows near the wall, her figure quiet, a witness rather than a participant. She clasped her cane with both hands, her face unreadable, but in the stillness of the room she was a presence as necessary as air. No one looked at her, no one thanked her, yet the night's vow still bound her there, as silent and steadfast as a shadow. A year passed, and Maplewood carried on as though nothing had changed, its streets as empty, its windows as guarded, and its whispers as sharp as ever. Yet for one boy, the storm that had once nearly broken him returned in a crueler form. Eliza Ward's health, fragile even after that desperate night, had slowly unraveled despite every effort, and by the following winter she was gone, her body claimed by the illness that never released its grip. Ethan, now 10, stood at her graveside with hands clenched in fists too small to hold grief, his face pale, his clothes ragged, and his heart hollow with the finality of being left behind. In the months that followed, he survived by piecing together scraps of work no child should ever have carried, hauling crates at the market, sweeping floors at the garage, collecting bottles and cans from alleys for pennies at a time. He ate only what he could buy or what kind strangers occasionally gave, his body thin, his eyes sharper than any boy his age should have worn. Yet through each long day and bitter night, one thought guided him: the woman who had once opened her door when no one else would. Clara Johnson's lamp had been the only light left burning that night, and now, with nothing else to hold him, he set his feet once more toward her store. The evening he arrived, rain fell soft rather than furious, a drizzle that misted the sagging rooftops and glistened on cracked pavement. Clara sat inside her store, counting coins into neat piles, her face lit by the lamp's golden glow. She looked up at the sound of the bell above the door and froze when she saw him. Ethan stood there, taller by an inch, still thin but with a wiry strength in his limbs, his hair longer, his hands roughened from labor. His clothes were worn, a size too small, patched at the elbows, and in his fist he clutched a bundle of bills crumpled and damp from his pocket. He stepped forward, placed the money on the counter, and with a trembling voice said, "This is yours. For what you gave us. I promised I'd pay it back." Clara stared at the boy, then at the small, pitiful stack of bills, each one earned by work no child should have endured. Her chest ached with the sight, the echo of her own childhood returning in sharp relief. Slowly she pushed the money back toward him, her hand rough yet gentle, and leaned forward to draw him into her arms. Her voice cracked but carried its truth like a hymn. "If you want, let me be your mother from this day on." For a long heartbeat, Ethan stood rigid, as though afraid to believe, and then the dam inside him broke. He clutched her tightly, his shoulders shaking, his face pressed against the faded scarf at her neck. His words spilled out in sobs muffled by her coat. "I want that. I don't want to be alone." Clara closed her eyes, holding him with the strength of someone who knew the weight of loneliness, and in that embrace a vow was born. Not of blood, but of choice. A vow to build family where the world had tried to deny it. From that day forward, Ethan stayed in Clara's store, sleeping in the small upstairs room where dust had long gathered, learning to stack shelves, count the till, sweep the wooden floor in deliberate strokes just as Clara's father had once taught her. In the mornings, Clara sent him to school, standing at the door to watch until his figure disappeared around the corner, and in the afternoons he returned to work beside her, his hands steady, his eyes focused. She packed him lunches with bread and fruit, patched his clothes when they tore, and each evening reminded him with quiet certainty, "You are mine now." The town noticed, of course, and its whispers traveled fast. Some scoffed at the sight of a white boy under the care of a black widow, muttering words that stung, while others shook their heads and dismissed the pairing as folly bound for ruin. Sheriff Tom Walker, who patrolled those streets with eyes sharp to every detail, carried his doubts more openly. He disapproved of the arrangement, muttering about impropriety, about how the world would see it, and he stopped by the store more often than before, his presence heavy with suspicion. Yet time has a way of stripping falsehood from truth, and what Tom saw began to gnaw at his certainties. He saw Ethan bow his head politely to elders who visited the store, heard him answer, "Yes, ma'am," and "Thank you, sir," with a sincerity unusual in boys his age. He watched him return from school with books tucked carefully under his arm, sit at the counter to finish lessons before lifting crates twice his weight without complaint. And he saw Clara, steady as stone, guiding him with quiet patience, correcting his errors with firmness but never cruelty, her weathered hands shaping the boy's life with tenderness that asked for nothing in return. The sheriff never admitted it, not to Clara, not even to himself. But the walls of his judgment began to crack. When he caught himself standing outside the store longer than necessary, watching the boy sweep the floor with slow, deliberate strokes, he felt a pang of something unfamiliar. Not just doubt, but respect. The widow he had once dismissed as foolish, the child he had once scolded as a liar, together had become something Maplewood had not seen in years. A family, forged not by blood but by resilience and choice. As seasons turned, the bond between Clara and Ethan deepened, tested by the town's whispers, strengthened by each day's work and each night's shared meal. He grew taller, his shoulders broadening, his eyes steady, while she grew older, her steps slower. But their rhythm became one. In a town that often turned its back on mercy, they built their own circle of light, one lamp burning late into the night as proof that family could be born in the unlikeliest of places. And though the world outside still doubted, inside those walls hope had found a home. Years passed in Maplewood, each season layering hardship upon memory. Yet within Clara's small store, the rhythm of life endured. Ethan grew taller, his once fragile frame strengthened by labor and study, while Clara's back bent further with age, though her spirit only hardened. The whispers that had once mocked them softened with time, replaced by nods of acknowledgement when the boy carried his books home from school, or swept the store with quiet focus. Still, the town never fully claimed them, keeping kindness at arm's length until the day would come when silence could no longer contain what had been built in sacrifice. By his late 20s, Ethan Ward had become a man of stature, his shoulders squared with resolve, his voice calm and deliberate, his eyes carrying the weight of promise unbroken. He had spent nights under Clara's lamp, bent over anatomy charts and dog-eared textbooks, each page turned with a determination that came not from ambition but from memory. He worked to honor the mother who had given him life and the woman who had given him a future. The boy who had once begged for help in a storm had grown into a physician, tempered not only by knowledge but by gratitude that burned steady in his chest. The morning of his graduation unfolded with the brilliance of spring. Dogwood trees bloomed across the campus lawns, their petals drifting like pale confetti against the bright sky, while families filled the rows of chairs set neatly before the stage. Mothers fussed with gowns, fathers straightened caps, laughter spilled across the air. Clara sat among them in her best blue dress, the scarf wrapped carefully at her throat, her cane balanced across her knees. Her silver hair was pinned into a tight bun, her face lined with years but radiant with quiet pride. For all the wealth and polish around her, she carried herself with a dignity that no gossip could stain. The ceremony moved through speeches and lists of names, applause rising and fading in waves, until Ethan's was called. He crossed the stage in his gown, the fabric flowing with each step, his cap tilted slightly, his stride purposeful, but weighted with emotion. When he reached the podium, silence fell, not because the crowd expected something grand, but because something in his presence commanded it. He cleared his throat, steadying his voice, and began. Today, I'm told to speak of achievement. But what I know is not my own strength. I stand here because of two women. One gave me life, my mother, Eliza Ward, who worked until her body could give no more. The other gave me a future, Clara Johnson, who opened her door when the world had closed theirs. His words struck the hall with a clarity sharper than any prepared speech. Murmurs rippled, heads turned toward Clara, whose hands tightened around her cane as her breath caught. Ethan's eyes sought hers, unwavering, and with emotion that carried more weight than any accolade, he extended his hand. Please, come stand with me. The hall seemed to hold its breath as Clara slowly rose, her knees trembling, but her will unshaken. Ethan descended from the podium to meet her, guiding her carefully up the steps until they stood together, mother and son, not by blood but by choice. At first there was no applause. Maplewood's people, gathered in the pride of their own children, froze in the face of a truth they had long ignored. Clara had lived in their town for decades, yet rarely had anyone offered her more than suspicion. Now here she was, honored by the man they celebrated, placed at the heart of his triumph. The silence weighed heavy until Sheriff Tom Walker moved. Older now, streaks of gray in his hair, his frame still solid in his uniform, he rose from his chair. He looked at Clara, his jaw tight, his eyes unreadable, and then slowly he began to clap. The sound was deliberate, each strike of his hands echoing in the hall, and then, like a spark on dry tinder, the room followed. Applause rose, hesitant at first, then swelling into thunder until the entire hall stood. Mothers, fathers, children, professors, every hand came together in recognition, voices breaking into cheers. For the first time in her life, Clara Johnson was seen not as an outcast or a widow, but as a pillar of grace, a woman whose kindness had shaped the very man they now honored. Tears blurred her vision, but she stood tall beside Ethan, her pride quiet yet unshakable. When the ceremony closed, Ethan lingered on stage with Clara by his side, his arm firm around her shoulders. He bent close and whispered, "This is only the beginning." And he kept that vow. Months later, at the edge of Maplewood, where the streets thinned into open fields, a modest brick building rose, its windows clean, its walls painted with care. Above the entrance hung a sign, "Second Chances Clinic," and below, in letters small but deliberate, the words, "Giving second chances because I was once given mine." The clinic opened its doors to all who came, families too poor for medicine, elders long neglected, children coughing in silence. Ethan moved from room to room, his white coat crisp, his manner calm, each word carrying patience born of lived experience. Clara often sat near the front desk, greeting visitors with a nod, her cane resting by her chair, her presence steady as a guardian. For those who entered, she was the quiet heart of the place, proof that compassion outlives storms. Sheriff Tom became its protector, his patrol car often parked outside, his presence a shield against anyone who might question or mock. Though he spoke little of it, his loyalty was evident, and sometimes, in the quiet of an evening, he would share coffee with Clara, the weight of years settling into respect. Maplewood itself began to shift, its people carrying a new story, of a boy once saved by kindness, of a doctor who returned with healing hands, of a widow whose light had burned long enough to change them all. In time, Clara Johnson's name became synonymous not with pity or scandal, but with resilience, sacrifice, and love. She did not seek monuments nor titles, yet her legacy stood in the lives healed within those walls and in the son who called her mother. Maplewood, once a place of shadows, learned to speak her name with reverence, and though she remained the silent hero she had always been, the world finally saw her for what she was, the heart that had kept its last lamp burning until others found their way home. In the end, this story is not only about Ethan or Clara, but about every soul who has faced prejudice, loneliness, and the weight of being overlooked. It reminds us that compassion can break the hardest walls, that silent sacrifices often shape the brightest futures, and that the truest acts of love rarely ask for recognition. To overcome judgment and to choose kindness is to give life where despair once lived. I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us how this story touched you, and join this community by subscribing so we can keep spreading stories of hope and silent heroes. May God bless every listener who carries these lessons in their heart and passes them on through their own acts of kindness.